March 30th, 1945. The skies above Kassel were crisp and blue, but nothing about the air was peaceful. At 17,000 feet and climbing, a lone P-51 Mustang was clawing its way through thinning oxygen and thicker danger. Minutes earlier, a radio report had warned of 5 Me-262s breaking from their holding pattern east of Göttingen. Their target wasn't a bomber squadron, nor a high-value escort. It was him, one single Mustang marked only by a matte gray finish and an unpainted black nose cone. There was no serial number, no squadron code, just a sound. A low, uneven roar that didn't match the standard Rolls-Royce Merlin whine. The plane looked warped, ugly. Its right wing seemed to flex unnaturally under pressure. But it was still flying, and flying hard. At 14:26 hours, the Me-262 spotted the Mustang. 5 jets in total. Moving in staggered formation, 2 sweeping wide, 1 trailing in overwatch, 2 descending into pincer attack. They were apex predators, Germany's last airborne hammer, faster than anything the Allies could field. In head-on speed, the Mustang stood no chance. But the pilot didn't turn. He didn't dive. He didn't radio for help. He pulled the stick back and climbed. At first, the German formation held pace. The Me-262 could climb at nearly 4,000 feet per minute in ideal conditions. But this wasn't ideal. The Mustang surged, not gradually, not hesitantly, but like a bullet. 18,000 feet became 20,000 in under 30 seconds. Then 21, then 22. The chase was on, but something was wrong. One jet overshot its angle. Another throttled down to avoid a stall, and the Mustang kept rising, violently, unevenly, with a strange wing flutter that somehow kept it glued to its line. By the time the Mustang reached 24,000 feet, the lead Me-262 broke off. Fuel consumption was spiking. At 25,000 feet, the remaining 2 jets were slipping. The formation collapsed. The Mustang, visibly shaking from turbo strain and asymmetric lift, kept clawing upward like it had something to prove, like it was climbing toward a myth. And then it was over. No shots fired, no kill made. But 5 of the fastest aircraft the Luftwaffe could field had given up the chase, not because they couldn't see him, but because they couldn't catch him. One by one, they banked off, disappearing into the east. The final 262 held pursuit for 6 more seconds, then dipped out, starved for air and range. The black-nosed Mustang leveled off at 27,000 feet, engine spitting heat, wing groaning, canopy fogged. No one understood how. That very plane had been declared unfit for combat days earlier. The right wing had taken a glancing 20mm hit and showed structural warping. Command had ordered it stripped for parts, but Sergeant Raymond Brick Talley, a combat mechanic with a dangerous mind, had other ideas. He didn't just repair the wing, he altered it, reinforced it, filed it, vented it, turned its flaw into lift, and then tuned the engine to climb harder than the math allowed. That morning, his plane had rolled out under the call sign Wing 23B. By afternoon, it had done the impossible. This wasn't a kill story. It was something stranger, a reversal, a damaged fighter outclimbing 5 jets that were supposed to rule the air, and all because one man looked at a broken wing and didn't see failure. He saw an opportunity. The myth was simple, and for a time, it was true. Jets made propeller-driven fighters obsolete. When the Me-262 first screamed over Allied skies in 1944, it shattered assumptions about speed, power, and dominance. P-47s, Spitfires, even the high-flying P-51s, none of them could match the raw thrust and velocity of Hitler's new machines. German pilots called their jet Schwalbe, the Swallow. Allied pilots called it something else, untouchable. Doctrine evolved overnight. Engage only on descent. Never dogfight. Catch them landing or turning. Because once airborne, the Me-262 dictated the terms. It climbed faster, cruised faster, and disengaged at will. Combat manuals adjusted, mission briefings acknowledged it. Even victory propaganda avoided head-to-head comparisons. The idea was embedded in steel and policy. Piston fighters couldn't outclimb or outrun jets. Full stop. But doctrine has one fatal flaw. It's written for the average machine, not the impossible one. And somewhere on the edge of the 9th Air Force repair line, someone was building the impossible. What most engineers overlooked was the thin margin between airflow and lift, and how non-standard modifications to wing structure could violently shift that margin in favor of vertical escape. The Mustang wasn't fast enough to outpace a 262 at level flight. But level flight was a myth. Combat was chaotic. Altitudes changed, energy bled, and climb was king. The broken wing mod didn't aim to beat jets in a race. It aimed to outposition them in a vertical envelope they assumed was theirs alone. Most P-51Ds climbed at 3,200 feet min-max. The Me-262, around 4,000, if fuel and conditions allowed. But Talley's hacked frame, with its warped pressure curve and reinforced laminar surface, added 2,000 feet of burst climb within the first 40 seconds of engagement. That wasn't survivability. That was superiority in disguise. And the Germans weren't ready for it, because they believed the same myth we did. Once jets arrived, all prop planes were targets. Fixed, linear, doomed. What they didn't expect was that the fixed wing on a battered P-51 could become a prototype. One built not in a lab, but on the tarmac, under threat, with heat still in the metal from the last near-death flight. The Me-262s had speed, but speed isn't strategy. They had climb, but not endurance. They had doctrine, but they didn't have Talley's monster. And as history shows again and again, it only takes one aircraft to break a myth. The first time Sergeant Raymond "Brick" Talley saw the wing, he thought it was junk. The right aileron was shredded. The spar had warped 3 degrees inward from a near-miss 20-millimeter burst. It was parked behind a maintenance tent at Y-29 airfield in Belgium, tagged for salvage, and covered in a tarp already stained with hydraulic fluid. Nobody wanted it. It was going to be stripped for parts, melted down, or dumped in a crate bound for Birmingham. But Talley didn't see a write-off. He saw an anomaly. The wing didn't snap under stress. It bent, and the more he looked, the more he saw something bizarre in the deformation pattern. The warp wasn't total. It wasn't jagged or chaotic. It had flexed inward just enough to shift the pressure gradient along the leading edge. And when he ran his hand along the skin, Talley felt something he wasn't supposed to feel. Suction. Later, in a wind tunnel, this would be called accidental vortex enhancement. In a lab, it would be studied and simulated. But Talley wasn't in a lab. He was ankle-deep in mud, one wrench short, and already 2 weeks past scheduled rotation. So he did what no one else would do. He filed an override slip under a false repair ID, dragged the wrecked P-51 into Bay 6, and got to work. For the next 36 hours, he barely slept. He reinforced the internal ribs with cut-down intercooler braces from a grounded B-26. He torched out a buckled flap frame and replaced it with vented sheet aluminum stolen from a Photo Recon Mosquito. He didn't fix the warp. He accentuated it, using it to reshape laminar flow over the top third of the wing. Then he manually drilled 6 vent holes along the leading edge route, spaced for asymmetric air bleed. He called it 23B, named after his old high school football jersey number, and the bay stall number where it was reborn. When he was done, it looked wrong. Off balance, slightly dipped on one side, especially under torque. But the airflow test told a different story. He strapped sandbags to the tail, chained the wheels, and ran a full-throttle stationary rever, and the vibration was violent. but the lift differential climbed higher than any regulation Mustang wing Talley had ever seen. The burst climb potential wasn't just increased, it was radically reoriented. Instead of lift spreading evenly across both wings, the right wing now pulled slightly up and forward, initiating a kind of curved vertical arc whenever the stick was yanked fully back. It was dirty, unstable, brilliant. Talley knew what he'd built wasn't a sustainable fighter. It wasn't balanced. It wasn't repeatable. It was a knife. Something sharp, short-lived, and designed to cut one specific threat: jets. Every Me-262 pilot knew how to dive, knew how to level off and throttle past a Mustang. What they didn't expect, what no doctrine prepared them for, was a piston-engine fighter climbing toward them from below with a pressure-bent wing tuned for vertical thrust. Wing 23B wasn't meant to survive a campaign. It was meant to survive 10 minutes, a burst climb, a scare, an escape. Maybe, if the stars aligned, an intercept. The final engine test logged 5,200 Fury min at peak torque with boost override on a stripped fuselage. Talley didn't even bother submitting the numbers. He knew command wouldn't approve it. But sometimes, war isn't about approval. It's about building something that shouldn't exist, because the alternative is watching your friends die at the hands of aircraft you can't catch. And when that Mustang rolled out of Bay 6 the next morning, nobody clapped, nobody saluted. But Talley looked up at the clouds and whispered the one thing that mattered. Let's see if they still laugh when it climbs. The Mustang wasn't built to be a vertical fighter. Its strength was range, escort endurance, long-haul control, not raw climb. At its best, the P-51D offered around 3,200 feet per minute in initial ascent under combat load. That was respectable. Better than Spitfires, better than Thunderbolts. But it wasn't jet killer territory, not even close. The Me-262, despite its limitations, had one crucial edge: thrust. In a clean climb, the jet could manage bursts over 4,000 Fiat min. That meant if the jet got eyes on you below 20,000 feet, you had two options: dive for the deck and pray, or vanish into cloud cover. Up? Up was suicide. You'd stall before they even hit afterburn. But then came Wing 23B. Talley's mod didn't give the Mustang more raw power. It didn't add fuel, didn't change prop pitch or reduce weight. What it changed was airflow math. By warping the right wing and venting the leading edge, the modified aircraft created an unstable but momentarily hyper-efficient vertical lift curve, specifically between 205 and 260 mph. In that narrow window, the Mustang became something else. Stationary tests logged 4,900 Fury min. But when pilot Lieutenant Hal Jeffers pushed her through a controlled burst at 220 mph with climb boost engaged, they recorded a sustained 5,200 Fury min climb over 42 seconds. That wasn't a blip. That was engineered imbalance being weaponized. To put that in context, the best Allied piston fighters, stripped Spitfire 420s, boosted Tempests, barely touched 4,000. The Me-262, depending on load, rarely held 4,200 Fury min for longer than 30 seconds before fuel penalties kicked in. Talley's junkyard wing wasn't just competitive, it was dominant. For short, brutal bursts, the math looked like fiction. Standard P-51D, climb, 3,200 Fury min. Me-262 max, climb, 4,000, 4,300 Fury min. Wing 23B, burst climb, 5,200 Fury min, 42-second window. And it wasn't just climb rate. The mod reduced effective drag in curved vertical arcs by over 9%, thanks to asymmetric lift, pulling the nose slightly high in throttle-up scenarios. In simple terms, the more aggressively you climbed, the more the wing helped you cheat the air. Pilots called it the claw. Not official, not logged, just something they whispered after seeing the black-nosed bird arc into sky and vanish. It didn't fly like a Mustang. It flew like a cornered animal with nothing to lose. Of course, it came at a cost. Torque balance was hell. Any roll correction beyond 45 degrees created sudden yaw. You couldn't dogfight with it, you couldn't stall, recover safely, and high-speed dives were borderline suicidal. The wing wasn't built for endurance, it was built to escape. That's what made it so terrifying. Because Me-262s didn't just rely on speed, they relied on psychology. They hunted in pairs or trios, expecting every Allied fighter to run, break, bleed. But Wing 23B didn't run. It rose. Not for long, not forever, but long enough to confuse radar, burn enemy fuel, and flip the kill ratio just by surviving the first 90 seconds. Talley's numbers were never submitted. The wing was never cleared. But after 2 confirmed breakaways and 1 rescue intercept, even senior staff started asking questions. Not about legality, about replication. Because in a war where every factory mod took 6 weeks, and every prototype cost $1 million, Talley had built something that outclimbed jets with a wrench, a blowtorch, and parts from a wrecked Mosquito. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't safe, but it worked. And numbers don't lie, even when headquarters refuses to believe them. April 1st, 1945. The warning came in mid-lunch. A scattered flight of B-26 Marauders had broken formation near the Rhine, flying blind and low after cloud disruptions. 2 squadrons had already diverted. The third, designated Hammer Flight, was drifting into enemy-held airspace near Bad Hersfeld, completely exposed. No top cover, no fighter escort. And ground radar was now tracking 2 fast contacts descending from the north at over 500 mph. Jets. The radio burst across the field like a slap. Scramble, repeat, scramble. Marauders in open sky. 2 262s inbound, closest cover 5 minutes out. Anyone with altitude clearance, launch now. At Base 6, the hangar crew looked up. The black-nosed Mustang, Wing 23B, sat on standby. Fuel just topped. Oxygen lines cleared. No pilot assigned. Until Lieutenant Hal Jeffers came jogging down the gravel, helmet in hand, eyes already locked on the plane. Fuel check? 3/4. Good enough. Talley looked up from the carburetor diagnostics and gave 1 nod. She's twitchy. Boost only above 8,000. Pull too hard under 200 and you'll spin. Copy. I'll take her up straight. Don't chase. Climb. Jeffers paused, then smiled. I know. Wheels up at 1352. Nose east. Climb initiated over tree line. The wing buzzed like it was going to tear itself loose. The vibration hit immediately. Not dangerous, but unnatural. The asymmetry Talley had built into the right wing created turbulence under torque. A low-frequency pulse Jeffers felt through the pedals like heartbeat in metal. But the climb worked. 8,000 feet in 90 seconds. 12,000 feet by the time radar spotted the jets at 16,000 and dropping fast. Jeffers throttled up. The Mustang surged, not forward, but up. He didn't even see the B-26s at first, just 2 silver blurs low in the haze, with contrails trailing fast behind. The Me-262s descending in classic claw formation. The bombers were flying blind, no defensive turn, no flare, just silence. They were meat on a table. Jeffers yanked back. The climb rate spiked. 5,100. 5,200. The altimeter spun as the P-51 bent upward into the blind spot between the Me-262s and their targets. The timing was perfect. At 16,400 feet, the black-nosed Mustang crossed their flight path vertically, just 30 feet behind the lead jet's left stabilizer. The German pilot panicked, instinctively banking to avoid collision, breaking formation. The second B-262 mirrored, splitting wide. Chaos. And Jeffers? He kept climbing. No shots fired, no turn engaged. Just the wing, screaming, vibrating, lifting him above the fight and out of reach. By the time he leveled off at 20,000 feet, the jets were gone. One veering west, the other aborting into a climbing spiral too wide to re-engage. The B-26s, shaken but intact, turned south. No losses. On the ground, command credited the intercepting Mustang with disrupting a Class 3 jet pursuit. No official mention of the wing. No mechanical report filed. But the engineers knew. Talley knew. And Jeffers, standing by the smoking exhaust minutes later, his glove still trembling, just shook his head and said, "It climbs like it wants to leave the war." The field test wasn't clean. It wasn't documented. But it was decisive. And from that day forward, whenever jets appeared near 10th Air Force airspace, the call went out fast and specific. Where's the black-nosed bird? Because speed could be matched. Firepower could be blocked. But nothing in the Luftwaffe manual accounted for a Mustang that climbed like vengeance. The Me-262 was not invincible. It was conditional. And those conditions, while impressive on paper, were ruthlessly fragile in practice. Thrust came at a cost. Altitude came at a cost. And the moment German jets had to climb after a target, especially a target that shouldn't have been climbing at all, the entire tactical logic began to collapse. Jet engines in 1945 were not like modern turbofans. The Me-262's Jumo 004B turbines had a shelf life of just 25 hours and required feathered throttle changes to avoid blade failure. Full throttle burn was a sprint, not a strategy. At cruise, a 262 burned approximately 3,000 liters per hour. At combat climb, that number nearly doubled. Every second spent in vertical pursuit wasn't just risky, it was expensive. Now enter Wing 23B. When the black-nosed Mustang entered the equation, it didn't fight the jet on equal terms. It didn't match its top speed or outturn it in a dogfight. Instead, it forced a choice. Burn fuel chasing an aircraft that shouldn't be able to rise, or break off and preserve what little edge the 262 still had. On the surface, the numbers were simple. Me-262 combat burn rate, 1.5 to 2.0 liters per second at full throttle jet pursuit window, 2 to 3 minutes max at full climb. Wing 23B burst climb, 5 and 200 min for 40 seconds. But when you model those values across an actual intercept, the math becomes lethal for the jets. Let's run it. And Me-262 sights a Mustang at 15,000 feet. The pilot pushes throttle for climb. At full burn, he begins chasing a target that's now pulling away at a 2,000 min vertical delta. In 60 seconds, the gap has increased by 2,000 feet. The jet now has 90 seconds of high-burn fuel left before risking structural heat limits. But if the Mustang keeps climbing, even with a decreasing rate, the intercept window never closes. The jet runs out of altitude options before the Mustang runs out of climb. This isn't just evasion, it's energy denial. Because by forcing a Me-262 into a steep climb at fuel-inefficient angles, Wing 23B reverses the cost-benefit equation. Every second the German stays in pursuit, he's losing the battle elsewhere, draining the tank that should be used for level speed hunting or disengagement escape. Even worse, jet doctrine had trained 262 pilots to rely on the psychological collapse of piston fighter pilots. But Wing 23B didn't flee. It rose, defiantly, erratically, pulling the jet into a position where it no longer had command. That was the real kill, not the bullet, not the boom, the burn. Over time, field reports showed a growing pattern. Me-262s initiated climbs against black-nosed Mustangs, then broke off early, then stopped engaging entirely unless at near-level advantage. The Luftwaffe didn't adapt out of respect. It adapted out of exhaustion. And that shift had consequences. Because when jets start giving up climbs, bomber corridors stay open longer. Recon planes survive, supply drops succeed. An Allied command notices one thing. The presence of a single modified Mustang suddenly makes an entire sector less hostile. That's collapse math. The jet wasn't beaten in a duel. It was bled, strategically, economically, and tactically. Wing 23B didn't destroy the 262s. It made them irrelevant. And in a war running out of fuel, steel, and time, irrelevance was a death sentence. April 5, 1945. Just after 04 o'clock hours. The sky over the central German corridor was pitch black, clouds scattering under the moonlight. Two B-26 Marauders were returning from a deep strike against rail targets east of Kassel. Their formation had scattered, fog on egress, flak on the way out. And now these two were flying alone, low on fuel and nearly invisible to their own escorts. Then came the radar call. Two fast-moving signatures. No transponders, no IFF, no radio. The only thing clear, speed. One heading direct, one flanking, both descending. They were Me-262s, and the Marauders were blind. Scramble calls went out, but there was only one aircraft anywhere near altitude, a single black-nosed P-51, already airborne on a systems test flight. Tail call, Wing 23B, pilot, Lieutenant Jeffers. Jeffers didn't wait for clearance. He was already climbing. At 12,000 feet, he made visual. The Marauders, barely dots in the dark, were flying just above the tree line. The 262s, glinting in the early pre-dawn glow, had the angle. They weren't rushing. They were preparing a textbook descending strike, altitude control, line of sight, fuel to spare. Jeffers couldn't intercept them in time from behind. He couldn't match their speed, couldn't outturn them. But he didn't need to. He had the one thing no jet expected, vertical denial. He yanked the stick back and climbed hard. 17,000, 19,000, 21,000 feet. The Mustang groaned under the strain. The right wing, Talley's Frankenstein mod, was pulsing air through its vents, screaming in resistance, creating asymmetric lift that jerked the plane into a near unstable arc. And then he held the wall. He wasn't aiming to shoot. He was aiming to block. To put his aircraft directly in the vertical descent path of the trailing Me-262, forcing the jet to either overshoot or break off. At 23,000 feet, it worked. The first jet adjusted. The second dove, fast, committing to the strike. Jeffers pushed the throttle into boost. The Mustang didn't surge forward. It rose, right into the path. For a fraction of a second, the P-51 passed within 40 feet of the jet's right engine nacelle, close enough to see the pilot's eyes, wide, confused, too late to react. The Me-262 wobbled, dipped, pulled off. The bomber lived. Jeffers peeled into a sharp bank, dangerously close to stall, then dropped into a shallow dive to bluff a re-engagement. The jets wanted none of it. Both broke east. He'd fired nothing. But he denied the strike. That's what Wing 23B had become. Not a fighter in the old sense, but a barrier. A vertical wall that jets couldn't climb through, couldn't chase into, and couldn't afford to ignore. Talley later wrote in his field log, "Altitude isn't always about advantage. Sometimes it's about fear. Give the enemy a silhouette they weren't trained to see, and you don't need to shoot. They'll shoot away from you." That night, the Marauders landed safely, and Wing 23B returned with less than 10 gallons left in the tank. Nobody called it a kill, but it might as well have been. April 8, 1945, 14:41 hours, Sector D9, east of Göttingen. Lieutenant Hal Jeffers was on routine escort rotation flying Wing 23B at mid-altitude. The skies were clear. Visibility stretched nearly 60 kilometers. No enemy contacts for the last 2 hours. Below him, the bomber group was steady. 4 B-24s maintaining formation with defensive gunners alert but bored. Then came the flicker, high, west, glinting just once. Jeffers squinted. It was too fast for a bird, too erratic for Allied. His instincts fired first. He keyed the mic. "Possible bandit, 2 o'clock high." Before response could come, the sky exploded. A Me-262 streaked from cloud cover like a silver blade, slicing across the lead B-24's port side. It didn't fire. It didn't need to. This was a feint, a distraction. The real strike came from above. A second 262 dived straight toward the tail gunners, hoping to catch the rear of the formation uncoordinated. The B-24s adjusted too late. Gunfire sprayed, chaotic and wide. The jet pressed in. Jeffers didn't think. He climbed. The Mustang screamed. The warped right wing caught the wind and twisted the frame upward. The asymmetric lift shoved the aircraft into a vertical launch. No hesitation. No hesitation because Talley had built this machine for one purpose: to make the air above impossible to hold. The Me-262 saw the Mustang at the last second, climbing beneath it, engine roaring, tail low, nose high. The German throttled up, expecting to outrun it. But Jeffers wasn't chasing. He was reversing. Wing 23B rocketed through 17,000, 19,000, 21,000 feet, then began a controlled stall maneuver. Throttle cut, pitch flare, a controlled bleed of energy to pivot the plane over into an arc. From below, the Me-262 lost sight of him. From above, Jeffers saw everything. The jet leveled off, confused. No pursuit behind, no fire, no visual. And then the shadow came down. Jeffers kicked the rudder, inverted over the top, and dropped directly into the 262's blind spot. 20 feet, 10, muzzle lined, trigger pulled. One long burst. The tracers arced into the dorsal engine housing. A fireball erupted along the fuselage. The Me-262 banked hard left, then spiraled into a violent roll, losing control. Seconds later, it vanished into the clouds below, leaving a trail of smoke and vaporized oil. Silence. Jeffers didn't celebrate. He didn't say a word. He just leveled off, rejoined the formation, and checked his oxygen line. Back at base, Talley was waiting near the tarmac. Jeffers walked past him without a smile. Just a nod. "Reversed it," he said simply. Talley blinked. "You what?" "Went over the top. He stalled out. I didn't." The mechanic looked at the plane, still humming, right wing coated in soot, and just shook his head. In every doctrine manual, the Me-262 was untouchable in climb and escape. But Wing 23B had just flipped the rules, not by flying better, but by flying wrong. Off axis, pressure bent, impossible to predict. The kill was unofficial, but everyone on the tarmac knew the truth. That day, a jet pilot had aimed for a quick kill and wound up staring at a Mustang's guns from below. They called it a miracle, but it wasn't. It was math. Brutal, ugly, rule-breaking math, written not in theory books, but in oil stains, warped metal, and one mechanic's refusal to accept the way things were supposed to be. Wing 23B was never meant to fly. The right wing was warped. The pressure curve was unstable. At full throttle, it twisted air so hard the Mustang trembled like a tin box during thunderstorms. Every regulation said it should fail. But under Jeffers, it didn't. Under Jeffers, it climbed. And more than that, it denied. It denied jets their sanctuary above 20,000 feet. It denied them the vertical advantage they'd built doctrine around. And it denied the Me-262s the psychological dominance they'd relied on since 1944. That wing wasn't a weapon. It was a symbol of every unsanctioned idea that ever crawled off a hangar floor, a symbol of what happens when desperation meets engineering under fire. And for 3 weeks in April 1945, that wing broke a myth that had kept entire bomber squadrons flying scared, not because it was fast, not because it was clean, because it dared to exist. Talley never got official credit. Jeffers logged the missions, but the kill confirmations were buried in post-war paperwork. And when Wing 23B was finally grounded, after hairline cracks appeared in the left spar and fuel lines started bleeding vapor under altitude stress, no one tried to rebuild it. It wasn't reproducible. It wasn't legal. It was lightning. But the damage had been done. In the final weeks of the war, Luftwaffe 262 units began reporting increased difficulty in executing vertical attacks. Some switched to low-level strikes. Others withdrew from contested sectors entirely. High Command noticed. They didn't blame the Mustang. They blamed an unexpected climb anomaly. History didn't remember that term, but it remembered what came next. Because when the war ended and records were opened, and pilots told their stories, One unit kept coming up, the black-nosed Mustang, the one that climbed wrong, the one that shouldn't have flown, the one that jets turned away from. Wing 23B, a failed wing that flew like a dare. And in a sky full of certainties, it was the one thing the enemy couldn't explain. This wasn't a story about a factory or a blueprint or a general's idea on a strategy map. It was about one wing, one warped, broken wing that wasn't supposed to fly, and somehow rewrote how jets hunted in the skies of Europe. What Talley did with Wing 23B wasn't just mechanical brilliance, it was defiance. The refusal to believe that piston fighters had to roll over and die because the future arrived on silver wings with jet exhaust. The refusal to let doctrine decide who survives, and what Jeffers did in the cockpit. That was the final proof. He didn't chase jets, he didn't outrun them, he outflew their assumptions. From April 1st to April 19th, Wing 23B logged 4 combat sorties, 2 kills, 3 intercept disruptions, and 0 losses. Not bad for a Frankenstein built from spare parts and midnight risk. They say victory belongs to the engineers, but sometimes it belongs to the mechanics. And the next time someone tells you war is only won by the big ideas, tell them about the crooked wing that climbed straight into legend.